Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Howdy folks, and welcome to this video where we are going to take a look at a news article that talks about the influence or impact of 3D printing on tabletop wargaming. I read the title of the article and thought, okay, it might be a little bit clickbaity, but there might be something to it. So let's take a look at it together, see what it has, and see if it really is clickbaity or if it actually has something to offer. Let's check it out. So here we are at Wargamer, the online magazine, journal, whatever you want to call it. But the title here, as you can see, Forget Cheap Armies. Here's how 3D printing has really changed miniature wargaming. Now, with a title like that, if you're into 3D printing or wargaming, and especially if you're into both, you can't help but look at it. So that's why I say bit clickbaity, but if there really is something that I'm not seeing or that this article has that's fascinating about 3D printing and wargaming, why not learn about it? Maybe it's something that can add to your own gaming experience. So let's take a look at the subtitle here. 3D printing has transformed the miniature wargaming and model making industries, but not in the ways most people predicted. Okay, well, let's do a little thought experiment up front here. What are the ways that you predicted 3D printing might change mini wargaming? So when I think about it, obviously the first thing I thought about was indeed the cost. That to print a 3D model, just the model, is so much cheaper. I mean, we're talking pennies compared to dollars. Now, granted, if you have to buy the printer, buy the resin, the time it takes, the cost goes up. So there is that. But let's think of some other things. How might 3D printing change gaming? One of the biggest ones I can think of is it has absolutely unleashed design. If any of you have spent any amount of time on a website like My Mini Factory, for example, just type in something, fantasy dwarves, sci-fi space marines, elves, just something general like that. You will find so many creators. You'll be amazed at some of the ideas that people come up with to use the same tropes, existing, features, and yet still come up with new ways to do them. And by extension of that, stuff that you never would have thought of before. I mean, you type in dwarves, you're going to get a lot of options. Type in something else and you'll probably find, I can't even think of one off the top of my head because it's something I can't think of. Let's say you wanted to do halfling samurai. I'll bet you someone has actually come up with STL files for that. Or you wanted to do a sci-fi army but based in the Wild West. So kind of like a steampunk meets, futuristic or sci-fi or something like that. I'll bet you that exists too. Okay, so what are some other ways that 3D printing has really changed wargaming? It could potentially increase piles of shame because if stuff's cheaper, people are going to buy more. I could also see more and more companies now going model agnostic because unless you're running tournaments where you can actually enforce people playing with your specific models, it's probably better just to encourage players to use whatever models they want. If you want to provide a specific model set, go for it. But if you can't, it's probably a better idea to encourage the player to just provide whatever they want, and so 3D printing makes that possible. Let's scroll this down a bit, look at a nice picture while we come up with some more ideas here. Let's see, what are some other ways that 3D printing could change tabletop wargaming? I also noticed 3D printing, until at least recently, it's fairly fragile. Unless you start buying some decent resin that's flexible and a little bit shock resistant, you got to be more careful with your armies. So previously, if you had metal and dropped it, it might bend, might chip. Plastic just bounces, but 3D printed resin is more likely to shatter unless you're using really high quality stuff. What are some other ways that 3D printing will change tabletop wargaming? It will shift from big businesses to small ones. Think how often you'll go on Etsy to buy something, or you'll ask at your local gaming store, hey, does anyone have a 3D printer that can print this thing for me? Rather than doing what most of us would do previously is go to a store or buy something through a big company. So that's another thing. I wouldn't necessarily say it democratizes design and sales, but that's not a bad way to put it. What are some other ways? It could encourage unofficial uniform scaling. If everyone's using their same models across different games, you still need some kind of common language. You can't bring 32 millimeter heroic to play against someone's 15 millimeter epic. That's not going to work. I don't know. Some of these are getting to be a bit of a stretch. I'm sure I could probably spend a whole video here just sitting here musing ways that I could see 3D printing changing tabletop wargaming. But point taken, or I'll make my point here, I can think of a lot, so I'm very curious if Mr. Lindward has come up with one that's radically new, significantly important, that none of us have thought of before. So let's take a look and see what he has to say. 10 years ago, one inquiring soul asked the public at Quora, will 3D printing undermine Games Workshop figurine business? It's a question that people are still asking today, in game stores, social media posts, and as the rhetoric titles of YouTube videos. A hobbyist with a 3D printer and a bottle of resin can make any miniatures they like for a fraction of the cost of an official kit. How could this tech not be a threat to established businesses? But in the decades since that Quora post, Games Workshop has gone from strength to strength, and the miniature wargaming industry as a whole is larger than ever. Even so, 3D printing has been a powerful and disruptive force, just not in the way that people think. Okay, so they acknowledged the generic one. It is interesting that they're still using, they're substituting Games Workshop for tabletop wargaming. I mean, granted, because it's the largest tabletop wargame out there, it makes sense, but at the same time, I wonder if anyone would have stats on this. If you could take how much of the market does GW have and how much do all other tabletop games have together if you allow, for example, if a player plays GW and plays other stuff, plays Warhammer models and other stuff, if you count those both times. I'm just curious. But anyways, yeah, I don't like it when... it's one thing to refer to GW as the biggest. It's another thing to refer to it as the only, which is what this is doing here. So should the article have been titled something about will 3D printing, or how has 3D printing affected Games Workshop, rather than wargaming as a whole? So what's the other thing he set up here? That Games Workshop has gone from strength to strength. Well, yes, but they're not just in the business of making models anymore. TV shows, other merchandise, board games. Perhaps that's why. Maybe they did see the 3D printing coming down the pike, and so now they're starting to try and reach out into games and media, and they launched Warhammer Plus and all this other stuff. It could be they do actually see it. But let's go here. So first, let's address why 3D printers still aren't the main way that people get their miniatures. Well, I have my reasons, but let's see. When everything's working well, they really are magic, turning goo and electricity into highly detailed finished miniatures. But when they're not working well, I have a whole article about that. And anyone who's printed and learned that learning curve, you know exactly what he's talking about. In fact, that's the reason I got out of 3D printing. All of the stuff around, the before and the after, the painting and playing with them, I got that down. But the printing, the cleanup, the sizing, all of that I found was way more work than I was willing to put in. Okay, still not onto the article yet. You can 3D print at home. If you're reading this article, you're more likely than usual to be someone who does, not necessarily, but most people won't. Just as most people didn't develop their own photographs at home in the era before digital cameras, 3D printing is the domain of dedicated hobbyists, print farms, and miniature manufacturers themselves, because it's still usually cheaper and easier just to buy miniatures from a retailer. Interesting point. Like, you're right. Most people didn't start a home photo development studio, but you know what they did? They went out and bought those Polaroids where when you clicked the picture, it would immediately spit out the Polaroid, and then you'd have to sit there and fan it in the air until the image appeared. People do like the idea of instant gratification, but he is correct that if there's too much work, people don't want to do that. But the thing is, printers are getting better as they're getting cheaper. So I'm not sure that's as strong of a point as he said. Most people won't right now, sure. But as these printers get higher quality, easy to use, easy to clean, easy to maintain, eventually people will, because they're just that simple. I mean, computers used to be something that only the geek at school and a few companies had, and classrooms and stuff, and now everyone has at least 6 or 7, if you count tablets and phones and stuff. Okay, continuing on. Even so, the continued rise of 3D printing has reshaped the miniature manufacturing industry and will continue to do so. Here's how. This space for rent. And then we have a lovely picture of a 3D printed mini here. So first, digital sculpting has been revolutionary for miniature design, but without 3D printing, it isn't a complete technology. 3D printers bridge the gap from virtual to real. In 2024, I, the author, visited Mantic Games and saw master mold maker Ricky Dove painstakingly preparing a 3D printed master model to create models for cold pour resin casting. He continues, last year, Archon Studios CEO Jarek Evertovsky, gave me a video tour of his studio, showing off both the finished plastic models for the upcoming StarCraft Miniatures Wargame and 3D printed prototypes of as yet unfinished models. The molds for polystyrene models are created using CNC milling machines and don't require a physical master model. But the process is so hideously expensive that you would have to be very brave or very drunk to press the start button without 3D printing a proof copy first. Digital sculpting allows miniature manufacturers to make more miniatures more rapidly. There's no need to wait for putty to cure, no problem with curing too fast, no need to build up around an armature. Sizing is precise, while components and model poses can be saved and reused. Perfect for building a consistent model line. Multiple artists can collaborate on a range or even a single model, and best of all, there's an undo button. So far, the one thing he's mentioning, the reason most people haven't thought of it is because most people don't own a business. So he's pointed out here that there are very important applications of 3D printing, not in the personal space, but in the production space. And I have no doubt about that. But is it that people, quote unquote, haven't thought of it or aren't in a position to think of it? I mean, how many of you right now think about new technology for use in, professional kitchens and culinary centers? Probably not, unless you are a chef. So, I'm sorry, the clickbaity's coming through a little bit here. Some people lampoon Games Workshop's promo photographs when there are 3D printing layer lines visible on the minis. But it's a sign of speed. Those promo photos were taken before the molds were even cut. And here we have an old school mold. The kind that the sprues we all know and love are made from. Okay, so far the first piece of information isn't, oh my goodness, I never thought of it. It's more of a, I'm not in that sphere, so I don't think of it. Well, let's see the next one, capital savings. Casting a model conventionally has a high upfront cost. For plastic models, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars to make a mold for a single sprue. Games Workshop's healthy profit margins come from the low price of polystyrene, but it invests literal millions of dollars making new molds every year, or, if any of you play Old World, holding on to stuff from 30 years ago and then reselling it at 2025 prices. Moving on. Resin and metal molds are cheaper to make, but need to be replaced as they wear out, and the cost of materials is far higher. There's still a substantial upfront cost for every production run, and the profit margin is way lower. Altogether, let's get the picture. This is cool. I can't fit it in. Anyways, altogether, this makes launching a conventionally sculpted wargame incredibly expensive. Check out our interview with Daniel Block about the incredible cost of getting plastic miniatures for his wargame Xeogenesis ready for the mass market. It's a key barrier to new games and firms. So here's a picture, a little epic scale. Full spectrum. I'm not aware of this one. If any of you guys know what game this is, let me know. It looks interesting. Okay. But if users can 3D print at home or get a print farm to make their minis, sculptors and game designers can make and sell models without putting any capital investment at all. You only have to look at the proliferation of sculptors on My Mini Factory to see how broad the gaming landscape has become. Oh, here's my answer to the question. Indie wargames like Full Spectrum Dominance, The Block War of Oil and Iron, The Promised Land, and of course, One-Page Rules don't have a presence on store shelves. Not true. At least not for One-Page Rules. They're getting it. But they have communities for their games. Okay. So again, this is something that most players probably wouldn't think of because this is a business thing. Or on the other side, people are very familiar about this because they've been to My Mini Factory. I know folks who don't have printers, have no intention of getting printers, but they still go to My Mini Factory because they know someone who has a printer. I wonder if he's going to add this as something that is a new way of selling models. If you don't want to buy the printer and you don't want to buy from a big box store or a major company, you buy the prints and then find someone to print them for you. So again, I'm still not seeing something that's revolutionary here. Interesting, but not revolutionary. Continuing on, the low capital outlay of nothing allows larger publishers to release niche products that wouldn't be profitable as retail releases. Modifius sells STLs for some incredible Fallout terrain, from a Vault-Tec vault to functioning vertibird, like it actually flies, while both Mantic Games and Steam-Forged Games sell conversion parts for their main wargames, products catering to the most hardcore fans. Again, this is nothing new. Folks found out pretty darn quick that if you go onto My Mini Factory, you can find just about anything you want. And then gaming companies realized that, yeah, they can kick out stuff faster by selling an STL first. And if there's a big enough demand, they'll start selling the plastic afterwards. In fact, that's something One Page Rules is in the process of doing. They started off as STL only, just as he says here, low capital outlay of nothing. But the demand from players got big enough that they've got the Broken Truth box set coming out and all of the plastic that's associated with that. So what's interesting is, on the one hand, yes, people who don't want to buy plastic are suddenly turning to 3D printing and buying STLs, but companies that started off only selling STLs are now starting to toy with the idea of plastic. I think what's happening is we're not seeing one overtake or destroy or outlast the other. What we're seeing is a new option, a very viable option, and so the market is now balancing. Players are trying to figure out to what extent would they prefer hard plastic models on sprues from companies that have been around for a while? To what extent are they willing to buy their own printer? To what extent will they buy something printed by a friend? And to what extent will they buy something 3D printed by a larger company? Not necessarily an Etsy store, although some of those can be pretty big. And how many companies are going to start going with like the dual strategy as well? They'll sell plastic models, but they'll sell STLs. And if you want to pay, they'll actually print those STLs to send to you. And if he didn't mention this, I was going to, and here it is. When Warmahordes released its newest updated edition, I don't know if the right word is pledged, promised, decided, all of their stuff is 3D printed. They even had a picture of their print farm. The resin smell must have just been unbelievable, no matter how well you have ventilation. But everything is 3D printed, because that way they print on demand. And would you look at that? The digital stockroom and print on demand. So let's continue. Like all consumer goods and gamer products, new miniatures sell better than old miniatures. But unlike every other collectible game, miniature wargamers expect models to be supported by the rules and on sale for years, if not forever. It's understandable, given the amount of time and effort we put into building and painting our models, but it's a nightmare for businesses who must choose between deprecating models and pissing off their most dedicated fans, or keeping unprofitable models in stock and pissing off their warehouse team and retail stockists. Well, welcome to supply and demand. 3D printing slices through this dilemma by making a company's backlist totally virtual. Steam-Forged Games is exploring this with its flagship game, War Machine, which produces exclusively via 3D printed resin, as I was just saying. It offers a core line of the most recent releases to retail stockists, but the entire back catalog is available on a print-on-demand basis, both to retails and direct to customers. And on the one hand, I think that's a brilliant idea. The only downside is you then have to wait. There's one thing gamers love, and there's something that stores rely on, and GW has built their entire empire on it: the impulse buy. When customers go into a store, when gamers go into a store, sometimes they walk into the store not with any intention to buy anything, but willing to buy something if it speaks to them. I have seen this lots of times when I've been in stores as customers and when I worked in gaming stores. People will come in and be like, I'm just looking around. What they really mean is, I want to buy something. Is there something here that will get me to buy it? And so while 3D printing is certainly good for the business side because it cuts the cost of printing or producing, storing, shipping, it does then put that on the customer, where you no longer can just walk into a store, buy the thing you want, and walk home with it. Instead, now you'll put in an order. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying, just like what I mentioned before, it seems what we have is a new method of providing models is finding its equilibrium with the existing method of providing models. Okay, let's move on. New markets. A decade ago, only Games Workshop had a truly global reach. Now an indie game can be developed anywhere with an internet connection and played anywhere that has a 3D printer. Full Spectrum Dominance is made by just 2 people, but boasts communities in Europe, America, and even China. There are benefits for larger businesses too. Steam Forge Games can produce its miniatures wherever it can find a print partner that meets its quality standards. So far, it's focused on centers in the US and Europe. Not only does this cut down on travel time, shipping costs, and carbon emissions, but it also gets around import tariffs in America. Because, no other country has tariffs at all. All right, interesting point here, that it's a way in by the back door. Anyways, think of what the internet did for information. It allowed anyone to learn stuff almost no matter where they live, like North Korea and China is the exception. So what 3D printing has done is allowed production to do that. You can't buy this particular model in your country or your region, but you have a 3D printer, you can buy an STL, download it, and then you can print it and have it in that region. So that is a very fascinating benefit, a very fascinating element of 3D printing. Not sure it's not something that is earth-shatteringly new, but so far it seems most of these things being mentioned here are from the business side of production, and yeah, most gamers don't think of the business side, they think of the gaming side. A broader hobby with a lower barrier to entry. For a long time, the assumption has been that 3D printers lower the barrier for entry for new wargamers by making the hobby cheaper. I think printers have had far more impact lowering the barrier to entry for new businesses and solo game developers. Not every wargamer needs a 3D printer, but we all have access to a far more diverse range of miniatures and games because 3D printing has developed as far as it has. Yep, I agree. And then he goes on, if there's anything I missed, any great 3D printed games I should know about, or fascinating examples of wargame companies using 3D printing in novel ways, let me know below, blah, 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 signing off. Okay, so let's go back and look at this picture here, because this game looks kind of nifty here. So, in summary, yes, I think these are definitely ways that people have usually not thought of, but it's not because they were blind to it. It's just because they don't think about it. Like when I go to McDonald's, which I don't, but let's just say I go to McDonald's, when I'm eating, I don't think about, wow, how does McDonald's maintain ranches and lettuce patches and tomato farms and potato farms in order to make this? I just think, I order it. Is it cheap enough to be worth it? Does it taste not bad enough to make me barf? Like, is it worth the money? And did I have to wait forever to get it? Every time a company comes up with a new method of production or distribution or something like that, unless they build their entire business model around it, the customer's never going to know. So this was a fascinating article in that it let us get a peek into how 3D printing has changed wargaming from the business side. But I don't think it was as earth-shattering as the title led us to believe. Then again, to be fair, let's head back to the top here. If the title of the article was 3D printing completely changes business models in wargaming, nobody would have read it. So it was indeed clickbait, but it gave us some interesting information to think about. Now, there was one thing that he talked about, which I think is both a blessing and a curse for tabletop wargaming, and that is it makes it easier for small companies, individuals, and other small enterprises to get into tabletop wargaming. While that's cool because it means anyone with a good idea can test it out, the downside, and granted this might not be as big a downside, it means we're going to have a lot of games to play. You can go into a game store as is and find more tabletop games than you could play in a lifetime. Even if you were to just play a couple for a few months and move on to something new, you'll never get them all done. Now that's good because it means whatever niche you're looking for, you can probably find it. The bad side, though, is it means it's very hard to find an existing community. You have to try and convince people to stop playing one of their games and start playing yours. And one of the first things they're going to ask is, am I going to be able to play this? Are there others that play it? Or am I going to give up a game that meets every game group that meets every Wednesday for a game group that's just you and me, and maybe that's it? So, interesting thing to think about. But what do you guys think? What is your take on what 3D printing might do to the tabletop gaming industry? What has it already done? What's positive? What's negative? Where might it go from here? both from the perspective of businesses and the perspective of players. Is there something we haven't thought of yet? Do you have the $1 million idea? If so, you probably shouldn't put it in the comments because someone will steal it. But if not, go ahead and put it down there. Maybe you'll give someone with the resources the chance to figure it out. Anyways, thanks for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Until then, keep your dice on the table.